Next, I want to talk about the colonial period in Southeast Asia. We've talked about colonialism in the Americas, in Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, and partially in the Middle East. And Southeast Asia was heavily impacted by colonialism. In fact, most of it was colonized at one time by one European power or the other, and then at certain times also by Japan. But we're going to talk mostly about the European colonial period. And with the exception of Thailand, which used to be called Siam, most of Southeast Asia was under the control of some European power at one time. And let me kind of take a wider view here. This is from a different textbook, but it kind of helps to show this. What you have, if you recall, with India and Pakistan, they were part of British India, but British India kind of extended over into Myanmar. So Burma or Myanmar, it was called Burma when it was part of the British Empire, was part of British India that included Pakistan and India. We also have French Indochina, it has the three countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. We have what's now Thailand, used to be called Siam, which was independent. You had the Dutch East Indies, which belonged to the Dutch, or what's now the Netherlands. And you had the Philippines, which were colonized by Spain, Spanish Empire, similar to Mexico and parts of South America. And lastly, you had Malaysia, which was colonized by the British. So I'd like you to know, move this figure over a bit, which were associated with which countries. Okay, so let's start with the British. We have two parts. On the peninsula, we have Burma or Myanmar, which again was part of British India. We also have Malaysia, and that also includes what are now the countries of Singapore and Brunei. Brunei is kind of an oil-rich little enclave that gained its independence much later. Singapore is a little tiny, we'll blow it up in a little bit. There's a little tiny island state that was, and both of these were part of British Malaysia. The French, on the other hand, controlled what's called French Indochina. That includes the three modern countries of Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. And then in between, so we have the French on the right, we have the British on the left, and in between we have an independent buffer state, one that separates two colonial powers, the independent state of Siam or Thailand. And over time, Siam had to give up part of its territory to either the French or the British, so that's what these green things show. But this is the part that remained independent, and that's modern-day Thailand. So know that Thailand used to be called Siam, and it was the only one here who was independent. Know that Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam were part of the French Indochina of France, and that both Burma, now called Myanmar, and Malaysia, including Singapore and Brunei, part of the British Empire. Now going out into the more of the insular or island part, we have kind of mostly two, but one other one. We have the Spanish. Let's start with the Dutch East Indies here. So Indonesia, back in the colonial days, was called the Dutch East Indies. And the Dutch East Indies, the Dutch, that's the Netherlands in Europe. And they controlled what's now modern day Indonesia. So Indonesia, what is Indonesia now, is formerly the Dutch colony or Netherlands colony of the Dutch East Indies. Now, Spain controlled the Philippines. Philippines were at one time part of the Spanish Empire, like Mexico, Central America, and much of South America. And except that it was like part of the, like for example, Puerto Rico, it was part of the territory that was ceded to the United States during the Spanish-American War. So in addition to Spain, the Philippines have a colonial history with the United States from the Spanish-American War up into the 1940s. Then lastly, we got to kind of look for this one. There's a tiny country here called East Timor, and East Timor was controlled by the Portuguese. It was a small island that the Portuguese had control of. Now, one thing I'll point out is that we have East Timor, which is Portuguese. We have the Philippines, which are part of the Spanish Empire. And that's also going to affect their cultural geography, because these are two places in Southeast Asia where Catholicism is still a dominant religion, primarily because of their colonial history of being part of Catholic Spain and Catholic Portugal. Here's a blow-up of Singapore. So this is Singapore Island. Let me kind of go back for a second. So we have the Asian Peninsula right at the very tip here, where you see Singapore. That's Singapore Island. And it was part of British Malaysia. And Malaysia became independent from the British, and like right after that, Singapore became independent from Malaysia. You can see here, it's just not a big place. It's kind of like a single city on an island. This is showing Indonesia primarily, but I want to highlight a couple of smaller places. This is Brunei. So Malaysia became independent from the British in the 1960s, and Brunei was held onto by the British much longer. If you look at this blow up here, one reason it was held on to longer is because it had oil resources. So one thing about Brunei is it has oil, and it didn't gain its independence until the 1980s. So just to compare, we've talked about site and situation, or relative location is one thing and site qualities is another. Singapore is relatively well, let's start with Brunei. Brunei is a relatively wealthy small country. A lot of that has to do with its natural resources of oil. Singapore, on the other hand, is wealthy not because it has oil or gold or anything like that, but because of its relative location. Singapore is a hub of trade in this part of the world.